And look, moving on from money and ownership and transfer fees, which tend to dominate the game, something that we might not necessarily think about as much in the world of football is the mental health of footballers.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk to you quickly about some quotes that Mbappe has said in an interview about how the French national team made him feel like a problem after his penalty miss in Euro 2020. And he's talked about how he got called a monkey for missing the penalty, and and this is a direct quote from the interview, which is, "But from the moment where I felt like that I was starting to become a problem and that people felt I was a problem, I received the message that my ego was what made us lose, that I wanted to take up too much space, and that without me, therefore, we might have won." And I really want to talk about this because, for those that don't know, I did an interview with Alex Chidiac recently, and that will go out on Park Instagram on Thursday, so
Nice.
cheeky plug. And she talked about what it was like as well to negotiate when she was playing, when she got an injury, and what that did to her mental health. And obviously this is not the same thing, the abuse of being called a monkey and stuff is not the same, but when athletes get called into question for being athletes, what that does to a player and a person, because mental health, and justifiably so, has become a very big conversation, and no more recently than now in the pandemic, as we're all stuck inside and negotiating what this new normal is. But seeing the likes of Naomi Osaka in tennis, Simone Biles at the Olympics, athletes standing up and saying, just because we're athletes doesn't mean that we wake up every day and want to do this. I want to know your thoughts about whether this is a necessary conversation, and how fans can contribute to solving this problem.
Yeah, I think the French situation is quite unique because, of course, the racial dynamic of the whole thing is so significant in France, and the idea of the kind of utopian racial inclusion in the wake of the 1998 World Cup team and the Black Blanc Bleu, union or whatever, being, black, white and Algerian essentially, or Maghreb, from North Africa, saying that, we're all French and we're all in this together. But the problem is, as Karim Benzema said on numerous occasions, when I win, I'm French, and when I lose, I'm Algerian. And that's a problem that is still pervasive in French football. We've still seen instances at the youth academies or even first division, Ligue 1 coaches in France being caught making incredibly racist comments offhand when they didn't think they were being recorded. It's a country that has never quite reconciled multiculturalism and come to accept that, being French is not the same as being white. It's a country where I think there's still a massive class divide that accompanies the racial divide. So when somebody as prominent as Mbappe costs the national team their place in the European Championships, there's unfortunately going to be abuse coming his way, mostly in the form of, anonymous abuse on social media, which is another problem entirely that I don't think has been solved by the platforms. But in terms of his mental health, I mean, he's still so young. Like, it's crazy how famous he is and how much expectation is on his shoulders when he's only, 22? And he came onto the scene so early, when you could argue that is an incredibly unhealthy thing for someone to experience, to be, on top of the world when you're only 16, 17, playing for Monaco. I'm not sure if football has entirely succeeded in its duty of care to, minors, to underage and super young athletes. But certainly Mbappe is someone who doesn't shy away from his ambitions, and I really like that about him. And he's also someone who's willing to speak openly about stuff and not, hide behind kind of pre-prepared statements from his kind of PR team. And that interview that he did with, I don't know if you remember Jérôme Roten, former France international, played for PSG.
Yeah.
He is like the biggest podcast hosts slash pundit shock jock in French football now, which is really funny. It's really,
Amazing.
really, really off base for this, 13 capped French international to be the most
awesome.
polarizing guy. But he has a show called Jérôme Sans Flamme, which means literally means Jerome sets. Oh no, Roten sans flamme. Sorry, it means Roten sets himself on fire or ignites. So every time he goes on air, he ignites about something. But he actually did a really good interview with Mbappe, which is in French, but you can get the transcript and Google Translate and glean what you can. And Mbappe talked really openly about how he felt scapegoated even before the tournament started. Remember that discussion around Giroud saying that Mbappe passes Benzema the ball, but he doesn't pass me the ball? Mbappe made the great point that Giroud plays in the penalty box, whereas Benzema drops like 40 yards deep to receive the ball to feed. They're entirely different players. Of course I pass the ball more to Benzema. It's just, I don't have a problem with this guy. So, I don't know. French football is incredibly polarized. France, the country, still has quite a notable radical right element in its politics. And unfortunately, Mbappe, being the young, bold, overachieving black athlete, is going to be a lightning rod for some of this criticism. So perhaps it will be better for him to get out of the country and play his football somewhere else.
Yeah, and because I read that article, and if you can only feel for him, to your point, to become so famous at so young is something that is just must just be insane to experience that. And like me and you will never experience that. But to think about other players coming through and looking at this as a model, right? You think about Gavi, who played this morning against France, you know, in the Nations League final. Think of Pedri. You know, we've spoken about these young players that come through, and you know, before that, we kind of like get excited about young talent. When me and you play Football Manager in FIFA, we get gassed when we discover some young gem. But then, as you know, now we start reading about these things, about the pressure that they're put under, and I think about stuff I've heard people say, which is like, one, you make so much money, you don't have the right to complain. You know, two, you're living the dream, you don't have the right to complain. Along all these threads of like what we think being a footballer and athlete is, and now realizing from these athletes themselves that it's tough to do this. There is a reason that they're there, and it comes at a physical and mental cost.
Well, I mean, we're not the only ones who get excited about Football Manager Wonder Kids. Mbappe in this interview was asked about Nuno Mendes, and he's like, I didn't know him when he arrived. I only knew him as a Football Manager Wonder Kid. So, you know, there's a lot of expectation placed on players very, very early now, especially when we've got so much access to things like FM and to FIFA, and these are the next big stars, and they're built up from such a young age. So I think it is something that football needs to improve, particularly with these players being so active on and so visible on Instagram, particularly. It's really quite dicey, and I do think the sport has a duty of care to its athletes. And I'm not sure about the kind of players' union situation abroad, but I do know that in Australia, the PFA does have a very strong program of basically having a player development manager with every one of its teenage footballers who are on pro contracts. So basically you have someone from the players union that is your contact and your go-to, who basically checks in with you all the time. And I think that, I hope that is happening abroad. I don't know what the players union situation is or how well resourced they are, because obviously there's a much bigger pool of professional footballers in Europe. But if that's not happening, I would like them to look into that, particularly for the top flight players who are getting all the exposure.
I think it's something that I think about a lot, because I mean, through my work with Park, like I get to talk to athletes, the people that are actually playing for a living, and it was a weird moment for me, like to make that transition of just watching, you know, and obviously me and you dreaming as kids to be footballers, and to meet these footballers and talk to them, regardless of the level that they're playing at professionally. I think it just goes to show that they're people at the end of the day. And they're off the pitch, that they have things going on. And when people say stuff and they hear things and they read things, that it all impacts it the same way that me and you would react to it if someone said something about us, or, you know. And I think that process really humanized athletes for me, which sounds awful because like all I know of them is just like what I watch on TV. And I think it's a bold and big move and a necessary one for people like Mbappe to Osaka, to Kyrie Irving in the Brooklyn Nets, to say, if I'm not feeling it, or I don't like, you know, how I was treated and it impacted the way that I perceive myself and my role in a team, in life. I think that's important. You know, because in every other workplace, mental health gets prioritized, some better than others. But I think, you know, in this day and age, we talk about it a lot because it is important. And I don't know, I feel like having met these athletes, I haven't met Mbappe, maybe one day, but having met pro athletes, I think it's easy to forget that they're people. It's easy, you know, because we just see them all the time, everywhere. And I don't know, I just thought it was an important thing to highlight.
Yeah, and you see their stats on a game or whatever, and then you see them play and you think, why aren't they, you know, playing to their potential, you know, numerically? And it's just, like, that's just not how humans operate. You know, it's just, everyone has good days at work and bad days at work. And at the end of the day, football is a workplace. And, you know, I think that's why I brought up the Players Union thing. I do think, you know, FIFA Pro and the nation-based unions are really important, because having somebody around you that is looking out for your best interests but is not financially invested in your career is super, super important. And I think that's one of the problems we see in Europe with player agents not giving good advice, because they're giving their advice based on their profit line, their profit margin. And that's why a lot of footballers end up using their family as their agents. And we laugh at Harry Kane's brother having a whole agency just for the one client. But footballers sometimes think that these are the only people they can trust, because the sums of money are so vast. It just attracts the worst kinds of people, the most exploitative. And you know, I think the support network around young players is so important, because how could you deal with that kind of pressure and attention and expectation on your own?